Well, thank you. There are, in fact, three parties in East Asia that make claims to the Diaoyutai or Senkoku Islands. The Republic of China on Taiwan, the People's Republic of China, the mainland, and Japan. My colleague and friend Ray Mo has spoken very eloquently of Taiwanese claims to the island, to the island groups, and I am going to examine something else to avoid a bit of overlap. I'm going to take a look specifically at the People's Republic of China's claims to the islands and to the government of Japan's claims to the islands. And I am going to adopt the role of intellectual gadfly, a particular part that I relish, and systematically point out the internal contradictions, inconsistencies, and purposeful misreadings of the historical record by both the People's Republic of China and Japan on the issue of the Diaoyutai dispute. So my argument in this talk is that, yes, ethnic Chinese, Han Chinese, have a longer record of involvement with a longer presence in the Diaoyutai than states on the main islands of Japan. However, history and a careful and accurate and empirical reading of the historical record really doesn't affirm either Beijing or Tokyo's claims to these territories. Both countries' official positions, again, as I mentioned a moment ago, suffer from a host of internal contradictions, of inconsistencies, and of purposeful distortions of the historical past. In fact, their positions say more about the ways that states purposely distort history with a capital H to serve their current political agendas. Okay, and with that provocation, let's continue. So, looking at the historical record as a historian, what in fact do we see? Well, I have no particular stake in this, and so I find that, in fact, the involvement of ethnic Han Chinese with the Diaoyutai Islands does date to the 15th or at least the 16th century. So that is true. The Ming and the Qing and the Republic of China were all involved at these islands. At the same time, in this earlier period, there was an independent kingdom, the kingdom of Ryukyu, Liuqiu, later annexed by Taiwan in the 1870s. Later annexed by Japan in the 1870s, became an integral part of Japan. Ryukyuan sailors also used the Diaoyutai Islands for their marine fisheries. And there was kind of an interaction. There would have been both ethnic Chinese and Ryukyuans who did not view themselves then or now as Japanese in this period. Okay, the government of Japan annexed these islands, again, as the Ryukyus only in the 1870s, and as Director General Mo pointed out, the Diaoyutai Islands themselves only after the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, Xiaowu Changcheng. References to these islands, to the Diaoyutai, do in fact abound in Chinese historical documents dating from at least the 15th or 16th century, while Japanese official records really only begin mentioning them in the 1880s with these planned survey trips. And so you can, in fact, look at this language that is replicated over time in historical documentation. This one in the middle here, I'll just mention, the County Gazetteer. There were forms of official knowledge production in late imperial China. Every little county had an official gazetteer, which was an overview of local conditions. Section 1 was usually on geography. There'd be a section on prominent people from the area, on the history of the area. This particular gazetteer from the 18th century does in fact make mention of the Diaoyutai Islands. The Hamalan County, which is now part of Ilan County in China. And the text is saying, oh yeah, okay, you've got the Diaoyutai Islands, and it's talking about, oh yeah, more than 10 ships could be in the area. And you see this language replicated in text after text. And that's generally a practice that will appear in the historical records, right? That oftentimes county gazetteers and other sources will simply just pick up the language from an earlier text and replicate it. So this abounds, right? You can point to a great many of these documents from the Ming and the Qing dynasty talking about the Diaoyutai Islands. Implication in the gazetteer is that probably the Diaoyutai Islands are in some way conceived as belonging to what's now Yilan County in Taiwan. Okay. So that's what the historical record suggests. No clear conclusion, right? Chinese there early, but also Ryukyu and sailors there early. Lots of official documentation early in China, later documentation in Japan. Okay, so this is the PRC's position, and we will subsequently poke holes in it after summarizing. The PRC. China established its sovereignty and its sovereign claims over the Diaoyutai Islands as early as the 1500s, maybe even maybe the 1400s, describing them in the maps, travel logs, and official sources that I've just looked at, like county gazetteers. There they are. You can see, literally in black and white, references to the Diaoyutai Islands, clearly an ethnic Han Chinese presence in the area. In fact, the Ming Dynasty, later the Qing Dynasty, then integrated them into its system of coastal defense, Haifang, its Haifang Zhidu, to guard against piracy, which it very conveniently defines as Japanese piracy, although in fact most of the pirates were Chinese, with some Japanese involvement, Korean involvement, Malay involvement, Filipino involvement. That's something that the PRC doesn't really want us to note, though. In fact, most of the pirates were coming from China. Anyway, so it's supposedly part of the coastal defense system as early as the 15th and the 16th century. Then, Japan annexed the Diaoyutai Islands by force by defeating the Qing dynasty in a war, the Jiawu Zhangzheng, the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. And then Japan governed them until the collapse of its colonial empire in 1945. Point 4. When it was defeated in World War II, Japan accepted the Potsdam Declaration of the Big Three, the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union, which stated, Japanese sovereignty shall be limited to the islands of Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku, and such minor islands as we determine, we being the US, the UK, and the Republic of China, the Soviet Union, maybe. And Japan then didn't protest after the Treaty of San Francisco, which dismantled its former colonial empire in 1951-52. Japan, of course, not an actual signatory to the Treaty of San Francisco, but it didn't say, well, we object to the cession of these particular territories in any way. Finally, the PRC says, we have claims to these islands because we officially protested, rather loudly and vociferously, the transfer of American administrative control to Japan in the early 1970s. So we have a watertight case. Clearly, the Diaoyutai Islands belong exclusively to the People's Republic of China, to Beijing. Well, there's some problems with this case that we're going to look at over the next couple of minutes. First of all is what I call the PRC's sovereignty problem. Okay, so China supposedly established sovereignty over these islands as early as the 1500s because it's mentioning them in all these various sources. China then integrated the islands into its coastal defense system against piracy, against the evil Japanese pirates, of course, even though they're a mixed bag ethnically. In fact, it referred to them as the Wokou, the dwarf pirates, or the Wonu, the dwarf slaves, a shorthand way of referring to the Japanese. Okay, problem with the sovereignty claim. Neither the word nor the concept of sovereignty existed in China until the late 19th century. So it's fairly difficult to say we established our sovereign claims over these islands in the 1500s when there's no concept of that. The initial word for sovereignty in Chinese is the result of an American missionary working for the School of Combined Learning, the Tongwenguan, translating into Chinese elements of international law, a text, and coming up with the neologism for sovereignty, 自主之权, in the 1860s. Later, the word in modern Chinese for sovereignty, 主权, is in fact a loan word that comes from Japanese, like so many of the neologisms and new concepts that were entering China in the late 19th century. So my point then is that any kind of pre-modern or early modern notions of territoriality, of control, of administration, or even of physical presence offer a really shaky conceptual foundation for modern conceptions and modern claims of sovereignty, given that the idea didn't even exist, the word didn't even exist prior to the 19th century. And this is a fundamental problem with the very learned and erudite Taiwanese scholar Xiao Hani, who works, in fact, on this subject, and who is most well-versed in the Diaoyutai dispute, that he doesn't seem to understand that pre-modern conceptions of control and modern conceptions of control based on the notion of sovereignty, which is a Western import in the 19th century, are not necessarily equivalent. It's a really kind of attenuated and tenuous case to make. Okay, so that's one problem. Another problem with the PRC's case, well, it's kind of self-contradictory. The PRC describes the Diaoyutai Islands as part of China's inherent territory, but this contradicts everything it said prior to 1970. Beijing, prior to that date, it insisted on self-determination for the US-administered Ryukyu, the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa, which were serving as an American base, and said, okay, they should have a popular vote on the subject. And indeed, if the Okinawans want to be returned to Japan, then they should be. Incidentally, Beijing also very clearly defined the Ryukyu, the Ryukyus, as including the Senkoku, the Diaoyutai Islands as well, as is reflected in this particular newspaper article from 1953 from Renmin Zhibao, which is basically the mouthpiece of the Communist Party in Beijing. So as official a document as one can have. In essence, Beijing saying that if the Senkakus, if the Diaoyutai go back to Japan, then the Diaoyutai Islands should go back to Japan as well. Okay, here's where the complicated international law doctrine of estoppel comes in, which an international lawyer could speak to more eloquently than I. But the basic idea is that no party can make gains by denying a fact or allegation that it's already accepted as being true. And so the idea is that if the PRC has already said, well, if the Ryukyus go back to Japan, the Diaoyutais should go back to Japan as well, that they're kind of part and parcel of the same thing, it can't now completely contradict itself. So this would seem to be a problem as well with the PRC's case. Then there is the issue of timing. Beijing only began to assert its ownership of the Diaoyutai Islands after a couple of things. Suspiciously, a May 1969 UN report indicated there might be significant energy resources under the seabed near the Diaoyutai Islands. And secondly, the US announced its intention to return jurisdiction of the Diaoyutai to the government of Japan in the early 70s. Well, why is this a problem? Well, the PRC had the opportunity to protest earlier and didn't even bother to do so. An obvious opportunity would have been at the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951-52. You recall that is when the Allied powers effectively dismantled Japan's colonial empire. PRC says, but we weren't invited. Nobody invited us to the conference. Well, that certainly didn't stop them from protesting the position of the treaty and the conference on the Paracel, the Spratly, and the Pratas Islands. Pratas Islands, of course, were placed under UN jurisdiction at the time. The Spratlys are still a subject of contestation for today. The PRC repeatedly and vociferously protested the position of the treaty signatories on the Paracels and the Spratlys, it made no mention whatsoever of the Diaoyutai Islands, which can mean one of two things. One, it either doesn't make any claim to those islands, or at the time made absolutely no claim to those islands, or two, it didn't believe the Treaty of San Francisco applied to those islands at all. It's subsequently contradicted itself on both those counts. It claims, in fact, it does have claims to those territories, and in fact, the Treaty of San Francisco did apply to those territories. So, really, it's kind of contradicting itself. Then there's the successor state problem. The PRC's claims to this island group are based on its status as a successor state to the Ming Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, and to the Republic of China. So the claims are problematic. The Qing Dynasty was a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire, not actually governed by Chinese. China was not governed by ethnic Chinese from 1644 to 1911. It was governed by ethnic Manchu. It's a little bit of a stretch to claim that the modern Chinese nation-state is a direct lineal descendant of this early modern multi-ethnic empire not actually governed by China, and particularly problematic for the People's Republic because it never loses an opportunity to vilify the evil imperialist Manchu who couldn't possibly effectively fight back the evil imperialists of Britain and the US in the 19th century. So it is the lineal descendant in terms of territorial claims, except that it is the savior of the nation by ultimately eliminating the Qing, right, or the Republic of China, which intervened. So that's slightly dubious. Rather more problematic, however, is its claim, that is, Beijing claims to be the successor state to the Republic of China. But Zhonghua Minguo actually still exists. It's called Taiwan. So how could mainland China have inherited the territorial claims of the Republic of China if the Republic of China is still in existence, and more than 24 states continue to recognize Taiwan as China. So it doesn't seem very likely that the PRC could have inherited the RC's claims when the RC is, in fact, represented right here, defending its own claims. Okay, so that's the PRC position. Dubious, riddled with self-contradiction. The Japanese position. So first of all, Japan refuses to acknowledge that a territorial dispute exists and bases its claims on the islands on the following grounds. So first, it claims that the Senkoku, as it calls them, were uninhabited. They were terra nullius in the late 1800s, land belonging to nobody at all. They show no trace whatsoever of Qing influence, control, or administration. The Diaoyutai were neither politically nor geographically part of Taiwan, nor the Pescador Islands, Penghu, which in the Qing Dynasty were ceded to Japan, again under this First Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95, Article 2 of the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Consequently, says Japan, we didn't give them back under the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951-52 because they weren't part of the first settlement, the first Treaty of Shimonoseki. Point 3, the US did in fact occupy the islands between 45 and 72, but Japan has exercised effective administrative control for the last 4 decades. Ownership in this case, or occupation is 9/10 of the law, is saying Japan in this case. And then finally, the Japanese government says, only in 1971, very suspiciously after the discovery of energy resources, and after the US announced its intention to cede administrative jurisdiction of the islands back to Tokyo in 1972, did either of the Chinas bother to protest. If they really made claims to the island, why didn't they say something earlier? What about during the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951-52? The PRC certainly made a lot of noise then, but didn't say anything about the Diaoyutai Senkakus. Japanese position is, again, also like the PRC's position, kind of a purposeful misreading. First of all, a dispute exists. During the last flare-up in 2012, there were major protests across 50, no less than 50 major Chinese cities, sporting rather pleasant things to say about Japan. My favorite image is, of course, this one. Diaoyutai is a fishing platform, the fishing islands, Diaoyu Islands. So one of the things that protesters did very cleverly was go to Japanese consulates and embassies and hurl dead fish at them, along with torn symbols, emblems of the Japanese imperial flag, which must have made a god-awful, stinky mess outside of these Japanese consulates and embassies. You see, this was going on in 50 cities, except there's no dispute going on. This particular image here is in a grocery store in Nanjing with a little patriotic Cantonese flag and saying, Diaoyutai 是属于中国的. The Diaoyutai are what belong to China. They're China's. All of these protests were accompanied by attacks on Japanese businesses. Restaurants were trashed. Sushi restaurants in Shanghai were taking down the reference to 日本料理, Japanese cuisine. There were hotels saying, we are temporarily not admitting Japanese guests. And, kind of despicably, there were hospitals in China saying, we're not accepting Japanese patients now. If you're sick, too bad for you. So a dispute very obviously exists, and there are these constant confrontations on the ground, or actually on the water, I should say, with Japanese and Chinese ships turning on their targeting radar on each other. Of course, there was the business we saw of blasting one another with water cannons. So the claim that a dispute does not exist is simply not persuasive. Okay. What about this notion of the Senkoku Islands being terra nullius, land belonging to no one? Well, that certainly was not the position of the Japanese government, known as the Meiji government, in the late 19th century. In fact, Meiji officials repeatedly expressed concerns about involvement in the Diaoyutai. What is the Qing dynasty's probable reaction to this? Could it lead to tensions and a potential conflict? We're not ready for a conflict in the 1880s. Let's put it off. There was an on-site survey conducted by the Japanese in 1885, not really effectively followed up. Basically, it was, if you remember, I mentioned this island, this independent kingdom called the Ryukyu Islands. The Japanese effectively annexed them in the course of the 1870s, and then they became Okinawa Prefecture. And it was the governor of Okinawa who had taken charge of sending out these survey expeditions. But in 1885, you'll see Japanese foreign minister, in essence, said, what are you doing? There are Chinese newspapers saying that those islands belong to China. And if we start planting our little red flag, then this is going to lead to tensions with China, which we do not want right now. We're not prepared. Our internal reform program, the Meiji reforms, has not yet reached a sufficient place where we are able to engage in active power projection capabilities abroad. The governor of Okinawa, who'd authorized the initial survey in November 1885, kind of agreed. He said, well, this is a problem if we send these survey expeditions out. He said, since this matter, the Senkoku, is not unrelated to China, if problems do arise, I would be in grave repentance for my responsibility. That is, he's hinting at that these are not terra nullius. There's already some kind of contested claim. And of course, by the 1880s, both sides have a concept of sovereignty. So there is modern kinds of claims that they're making. And we better tread carefully lest we offend the imperial government in Beijing, the Qing dynasty. The timing of these particular events is particularly crucial. Because the question is, did the Diaoyutai Senkoku Islands become part of Japanese territory prior to the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-5 or not? Because if they are established as Japanese territory prior to 1894-95, then the Treaty of San Francisco doesn't cover them, and they were not part of the Japanese colonial empire that was being dismantled. If, however, Japanese control and sovereignty over the islands does date from 1894, 1895, then the Treaty of San Francisco does cover them, and they are part of the colonial empire that was dismantled. Well, those surveys, begun in 1885, were never completed because of fears of the tensions it would spark with the Qing dynasty in China. So there were no complete on-site surveys prior to 1895, much less effective control. It's pretty clear that Japan seized these islands at the same time, 1895, that they annexed Taiwan and associated island groups like the pescadores, Penghu. The first Japanese citizen to rent the islands from the Meiji government, this guy Koga Tatsuhiro, in his memoir, his autobiography, actually affirms, ironically, that was the case. He said, Japan's possession of the islands came about as a result of the gallant military victory of our imperial forces in 1894, 1895. And the particular letter is simply evidence that the surveys were never completed prior to 1894-5. So Tokyo would have us believe that these islands were not, in fact, war booty, when the first person to lease them is saying, thanks to the Japanese Imperial Army, I now have these, and not covered under either the Treaty of Shimonoseki or San Francisco, except that it's pretty clear that they were seized as war booty only in 1894-95, not prior to that date. Okay, so both the PRC and the Japanese positions suffer from a host of internal contradictions. If we look carefully at the historical record, it affirms neither the position of Beijing or Tokyo. Rather, it's pretty clear that there's been a selective reading of the historical past, or in certain cases, a purposeful distortion of the historical record to serve their current national interests as they perceive them. Given the obvious legal, diplomatic, and historical ambiguities, it would make a lot of sense for Japan, China, mainland China, and the Republic of China on Taiwan to work towards a peaceful solution, and indeed to consider shared development of the island's fisheries and potential energy resources. This makes a great deal of sense. It's rational, it's politically sensible, it's pragmatic, it would benefit all parties. I'm pessimistic that will happen. I suspect that the mainland is likely to not reply to Taiwan's initiative because in the recent past, it's made much political hay out of posing as Taiwan's protector and trying to drive a wedge between Taiwan and the United States. That is, the United States has felt obliged under its bilateral security relationship, under its bilateral security treaty with Japan, to say that should there be an assault by outside forces on the Diaoyutai, it will come to Japan's defense. And so Beijing has been trying to position itself as the upholder of Taiwanese security and claims against Taiwan's friend, the United States. And I think it will continue to probably try to do that. There's probably a bit more room for maneuver on Japan's part. I could see Japan not compromising on the sovereignty issues. In fact, I think it's impossible that it's going to compromise on sovereignty issues, but it probably would be more willing to make a nod towards shared development of resources such as they be. Okay, what about the US? Well, I think the US should maintain its neutral position on the issue, but it should also respond, if necessary, to threats to the regional geopolitical equilibrium as necessary. That's obviously going to come from the mainland, from the PRC. US should use its diplomatic and political might. If the PRC chose to alter the situation by force, the US would have to respond in kind. That's very unlikely, but one should never underestimate the power of nationalism and domestic and factional politics in driving the dispute, which, if you're interested in that, you can ask me more about in the question time. But it's, certainly security interests are important, but nationalism and factional infighting, particularly in the mainland associated with the leadership transition, have had a lot to do with driving the dispute over the years. So I'm cautiously, well, I would like to see a negotiated solution. I have to admit I'm fairly pessimistic that I'm going to see we'll see a whole lot of progress on that count. Thank you.